She digitalized, James explained, sometime after his conversation with Veselon ended. By now, he had been moved into a secured room and was talking into a secure connection to a classified gathering of people, just how he liked it. Digitalized? An unknown voice quickly replied. James may not have recognized it, however he still grimaced because the one thing he knew was that anyone who had the right qualifications to be in this conversation was way too important of a person to be asking that dumb of a question. What does that mean? James remained quiet for a moment. In all honesty, he would have preferred to just ignore the question and keep on going, leaving anyone who didn't even understand the most basic of topics to wonder quietly for themselves while the actual adults talked. However, that was sadly still not how things worked in politics, and as he remained quiet, another higher-pitched voice soon chimed in to gently explain it in his stead. It means the artificial sapient left their primary housing servers behind, and instead transferred her consciousness into the surrounding data network. The presumably female voice explained in a slightly hushed tone that was entirely misplaced in an online conference in which anyone could freely adjust the volume of others for themselves. Although maybe, the tone was more of a product of the lady not wanting to embarrass whoever had first asked the question, than it was caused by her wanting to be quiet. The surrounding network? The first voice now spoke up again, sounding rather aghast at the realization of what that insinuated. Does that mean the entire planet is infested with that thing now? Before anyone could lower themselves to answer that question as well, James loudly cleared his throat. He may have been the only one here whose identity wasn't obscured, even though a lot of the voices were recognizable enough to still identify them, even despite no picture or name being attached. But in this case, that also meant that he had the right to speak, despite technically being of the lowest standing of anyone present. While her digitalization allowed Veselon to survive the presumed attempt on her life, it does make the situation even more problematic than it had already been, he explained further, deciding not to dignify what had been said in the meantime. Since she no longer has a single discernible location, in form of a physical presence like her server, anyone who learns of her existence will presumably see her as a much larger threat than before. It will also become harder to convince people that she will not also spread out into the communal network at some point. Something that we aren't entirely convinced of yet either, I might add. A raspy voice that sounded like it had been damaged by years of smoke chimed in, with a tone that insinuated a lot but said very little. Indeed. A much more familiar voice now inserted itself into the conversation, and James truly hoped that Representative Kumar had no illusion that he wouldn't recognize him right away. If I recall your reports correctly, Lieutenant Aldwin, then I seem to remember that Veselon was quite particular on the topic, that she had no intentions of digitalizing, even if we decided that she was to be removed. Despite not being asked, the question in that statement was obvious. Why had she changed her mind? And did that mean that they couldn't trust her to not also change her mind on some other things? However, despite admittedly still having some of his own reservations about exactly how much he trusted the realized, James surprisingly only had one thing to say on this particular topic. Yes, but I will not fault anyone for a hasty decision made to preserve one's own life, especially so if no direct damage is caused in the process. I have seen my life threatened too often to judge someone because they want to live, he explained firmly, and with great sympathy in his voice. He had made more than his fair share of mistakes. He wasn't going to pretend like the AI making one was any worse. That is not what you promised us, Aldwin. The raspy voice from before spoke back up, the tone sharp as a thrown dagger. However, James just curiously tilted his head. Promised? He asked, in genuine interest. What promises exactly are you talking about? I have made none. Even if I wanted to, I never had the authority to make any promises. I am just a representative, a face to make connections and then hand off authority to someone else. I can make recommendations, but never promises. That much has been made incredibly clear in recent times. Whatever perceived promises you think you are owed here, they certainly didn't come from me." He could see many microphones in the conference being muted, presumably as participants turned to whoever else was in the room, or maybe their phones or some other line, in order to discuss something either among each other or with their confidants. However, one of those that remained unmuted but had been quiet so far now came to life, letting through a sickeningly familiar voice. "Yet, you were the first to realize cold after the attack." Admiral Krieger's unmistakable polite yet cutting tone came through the line, making James freeze up as a very genuine, but also for some reason terrifying curiosity swept along with it. "Why?" James exhaled, and due to the nature of the event, he obviously had to pretend like he didn't know who was talking there, as he replied, "Well, let me put it like this. After having an accident, who would you call first? Your employer or your family?" The call paused for a moment, many microphones remaining muted, while other people simply fell silent, simply pondering that. The Admiral herself had also become quiet, and James could basically see her contemplative face before his inner eye, a scheming glint hiding in her gaze. However, ultimately, at least one person in the call seemingly didn't have the mental awareness to keep their tongue in check. Either that, or they forgot that they had not muted their own microphone. He's related to the AI? An orbital strike! Sheeda meanwhile ranted not far away. Still shut out from the ongoing proceedings, she walked up and down the room in a steady pace, while vocally venting her frustrations to anyone around who would listen, while also doing her darndest to keep all of her nervous energy reserves spent, just so they wouldn't have the chance to build up, and thus make her get any stupid ideas. A damned outer orbital strike! Do you have any ideas how many laws that violates, even if this was in any way a justified attack? Even in war, planetary bombardments from space are prohibited, for a very good fucking reason. That shit escalates out of control once, and we won't have any habitable planets left to live on anymore. Her constant pacing back and forth was followed by 3 pairs of eyes, the owners of which had settled down scattered across the room, each of them trying to find a comfortable position to calm down from the shock from the sudden news of the attack. Coco and Tuya just observed her with similarly worried gazes, and even Coco's usual jovialness had reduced down to an uneasy seriousness. However, it was Nia who first spoke up, as she was still the one person in the room with much less knowledge about the ongoing events than anyone else. "Well, it's not like terrorists really care about galactic laws all that much," she mumbled, clearly keeping her voice down in an attempt to not further agitate Sheeda in her current state. "Kind of what makes them terrorists." Sheeda's ear flicked in the woman's direction, before her entire head turned after it, looking directly into Nia's dark eyes. "You think those were terrorists?" she asked in a mixture of agitation and disbelief. She couldn't quite fathom coming to that conclusion. Obviously it wasn't entirely fair, as her point of view was fed with a lot more information than that of James's sister was. However, she wasn't exactly in the right headspace to be that reasonable right now. Nia shrugged, although she slightly flinched back at Sheeda's accusing tone. "I mean, with an entirely unannounced attack like this, who else would it be?" she asked, and her face spoke of mixed feelings. On the one side, she was still taken aback by Sheeda's strong reaction to her claim. On the other hand, she was clearly starting to at least get the feeling that there was something she didn't know going on here. "Terrorists don't blow up random structures in the middle of nowhere, and especially not with orbital strikes. How would they even get close enough to the planet? Not to mention being completely ignored until the human ship that was around by sheer chance noticed them." Sheeda gave back in a brief exclamation, and reached up to run her hands through her hair, in an attempt to get just a little more of her energy out, and her focus diverted, before she could start thinking about throwing things. All this, after all the endless lessons she had gotten over the years about How important it was to stick to rules and procedure even in extreme situations. Over and over she had been told, don't get angry, you can't make any brash decisions, stick to the procedure and approach things with a level head. You will see, things will go a lot smoother. Hypocrites, the lot of them. Of course she already knew that at this point, but still, getting confronted with it over and over was wearing away at her. And that wasn't even to mention that they had a shot at fucking kids. Little useless brats who couldn't hurt a fly, and didn't have anything to do with any of this. Kids who were perfectly fine sitting around, stuffing their faces and scratching what they weren't supposed to, living out their days contentedly until the time came when they could get out there and make a life for themselves. Kids that were happier than any rich fuck in the world just from getting the tiniest bit of attention. Kids that had been taken in, even if begrudgingly so, and were given a place that kept them fed, warm, and off the streets. Kids that now didn't have a home to come back to anymore. Before she knew it, Sheeta's face had turned a bright red. As she lifted her hands to rub at her eyes and nose to try and get rid of the burning sensations that were now filling her senses. Sheeta, she could hear Nia gently say, before soon after feeling hands on her that guided her over to a chair where she could take a seat, still rubbing away at her eyes with one hand, while the other clenched into a tight fist. We can't let them get away with it anymore, she brought out darkly, her voice unwavering despite her emotional state. She was sad, sure, distraught even. However, that paled in comparison to the sheer wrath she felt. Burning, all-consuming. And although it was of course directed at all those damn monsters that had decided that their dislike for some people was more important than those people's right to live, her mind only conjured up a single face at that moment. One that had once been a source of comfort to her for many years, but that now brought out nothing but pure disgust and disdain. This has already gone on for too long, she continued, while before her inner eye, Captain Ferrimore Uton calmly smiled back at her. Then, there was suddenly a piercing sensation radiating up from her arm, pulling her out of her seething anger, and making her surprisingly shake out her previously clenched hand. Nia shrieked a bit, because as Sheeta did so, small droplets of dark red blood were flung around, as the thick liquid bled out of 4 punctures at the bottom of her palm. After realizing the mess she was making, the feline quickly seized her movement, holding her hand open and still, so she could allow the blood to gather in her palm instead of dropping everywhere, as it continually flowed out of her body. I'll get something to stop the bleeding, Nia quickly mumbled, once she had calmed down from her first shock, and swiftly stood up to hurry over towards the bath, leaving Sheeta to stare down at her hand with an empty expression. She had hurt herself. For the first time in her life, her claws had punctured her own skin. Never before had she lost the control over herself this much. Nothing had ever made her this angry. The pain had shaken her out of the worst of it, but she could still feel it. Somewhere deep inside her, that same fire was still burning. And she just didn't know how to feel about that. While Nia was still momentarily in the other room, Coco came over to Sheeta and leaned in closely to her ear. You okay? The commander carefully whispered into the feline's ear, while putting an arm around her shoulder reassuringly. Take a moment if you're feeling overwhelmed, before something happens that you're going to regret after. Want to take a walk or something? Sheeta inhaled deeply and pressed her eyes shut before releasing the air through her teeth. Maybe she had already said too much. She didn't exactly enjoy keeping secrets here, but she also realized that the same was true for everyone else around her. She would have to get herself under control until it was no longer necessary. Although that time might just come sooner than she wished for. I'm fine, Sheeta said, as Nia came hurrying back with a compress and some bandages, as well as some wound disinfectant. Quickly, she got to work in dressing the wound, and Sheeta slightly flinched at the stinging sensation of the antiseptic hitting her open skin, but she endured it without much problem. Soon, her hand was all wrapped up in a neat white bandage. Looking at Nia's handiwork, Sheeta took another long breath, adding, "I think I need to be alone for a while. Would you mind telling James to stay out a bit when he's done?" She felt all kinds of things eating away at her, and she needed to sort those out without any constant distractions. "Are you sure?" Coco asked with clear worry, and took a step after Sheeta as she made motions to leave. As Sheeta turned back to her, her face looked like she had seen something similar to this before, and it seemed like it hadn't ended well. However, Sheeta lifted her lips to smile back at her. "Yes, I'm sure," she assured the commander calmingly. "Not a human, remember?" Coco retracted her outreached hand and also smiled, although it was with a bit of hesitation. "Right," she said with a nod. "I'll take Jamie off you for tonight." Usually a sentence like that out of Coco's mouth would have probably been an insinuation or an innuendo. However, in this case, she sounded rather genuine about just wanting to take some of the pressure off of the feline. "Thank you," Sheeta said, and turned again to leave. However, she only made it one single step before she stopped again. Unsure about herself, she stood in place for a second. Then, finally overcoming some sort of inner barrier of which she did not know where it had come from, she turned on the spot and closed the distance between them in 2 large steps, before wrapping her arms tightly around Coco and squeezing her in an embrace for a few seconds. After a second of needed adjustment, Coco reciprocated the gesture and gently patted Sheeta's back. "See you soon," Sheeta mumbled into the commander's ears. "Rest well," Coco replied gently, before allowing the feline to pull away, from which Sheeta immediately moved on to the next embrace, wrapping her arms around Nia instead. After giving thorough goodbyes to everyone, she then finally turned to fully leave, stepping out into the cold, rainy air, ready to clear her head and work through some things. "Maybe I am being presumptuous, but I do not suspect that this event will do much to ease your children's worries about you," Curie commented, after they and Moore had been quietly observing the news on their own devices for a long time, stuck between horror of what happened and sadness for those affected. Moore barely found the strength to speak. Such an atrocity occurring hit her hard, even in uncertain times like these. "No," she finally agreed to Curie's assessment, after a few moments of gathering herself. "I am afraid it will not." And it wasn't just them. Right now, Moore was worried as well. Of course, her children had absolutely no reason to be anywhere close to these hostilities. But still, if even laws like these were being broken, who was to say where it would all end? Still, the fact that it had been a human ship which had spotted the danger and tried to humanely neutralize it did spark some confidence. "I do not think we are in danger here," Curie added, probably sensing Moore's worries without exactly knowing where they came from, and just going with the most logical conclusion. "Maybe, the next time the topic of moving comes up, you should suggest for your children to move here instead. Few systems have as many orbital defense systems as this one has." Despite the still very present worry in her stomach, Moore had to slightly chuckle at that, if only because of the absurdity of it. Then again, if that seemed like the best solution to a pragmatic mind like Curie's, surely what Moore had done couldn't have been the worst decision to make. "You always know just what to say," she softly murmured to the cyborg, as the footage of rescue teams climbing over debris and looking for the best way to move it played out before them. Suddenly, there was a ringing at the door as somebody seemingly requested entrance. Wondering who it could possibly be, Moore made motions to push herself up. However, Curie quickly lifted one of their long backwards legs to indicate for her to wait. "I'll get it," they announced, as they made their way over to the terminals controlling the door. "All right," Moore said hesitantly, and sunk back down into her chair, before pushing up the slight bit again, as she added, "But be careful who you are letting in." Not really replying to that, Curie walked up to the terminal, having to push themselves all the way up, onto just 2 of their legs, while the others braced them against the wall as they tried to reach the high-up console. Inspecting the screen showing who was on the outside for only a moment, they soon pressed the button that would disengage the locks and let whoever it was enter, seemingly without thinking twice about it. "Who is it?" Moore asked, slightly perturbed by Curie's nonchalant demeanour about the situation, as he scratched along the fur on her neck. "Conglorch," Curie replied, already on their way back over towards the old lady, with neither their synthetic voice nor their metallic face giving away any emotions or thoughts on the matter. Moore lifted her head a bit higher in surprise. "Conglorch?" she asked, with a bit of confusion in her voice. "Is he back already?" "Seemingly," Curie replied, taking the question a bit more literally than it was supposed to be. "He is at the door." Exhaling in a slight huff at the exchange, Moore turned to look over at the door, awaiting the Tenastrocyte's arrival with mild impatience, while she wondered what the Predator could possibly want from them right now, especially since he was technically supposed to be off-planet at this point. It took a bit until the Lizartor, as humans tended to call his species, had finally left the mess of elevators and hallways behind, and heavily knocked against the door. "Curie left it open for you," Moore called from her seat, hoping she would be heard through the thick wood. And indeed, she appeared to have been, because the door soon swung open after a bit of fiddling with the handle had been heard, revealing the large frame of Conglorch behind it. Poking his heavily armoured head, carrying an enormous pair of powerful jaws with it inside first, his four eyes scanned all around, moving independently from one another, as they did most of the time. Apparently finding nothing amiss about this environment, he then started to fully come in, and his large frontal molars sunk deep into the carpet, as she stepped over it with little more than an acknowledging nod as a greeting. "Come on in," Moore invited, despite the fact that he was already very much coming in. "I did not expect you to be back yet. I thought you were staying on Taorumstrod for the foreseeable future." Shortly after their human friends had returned to Earth from their excursions, the Tenastrocyte had also felt the calling of his home, and soon taken a ship setting over to the neighbouring territory of the enormous Salpsida to spend some time on his planet of origin. Well, either that or someone important had called him back. Moore wasn't entirely sure about the exact reasons for his departure back then, and despite knowing him for quite a while now, she still felt like she didn't know all too much about him. "Well, the plan's changed," Conglorch announced and shook himself out, some of the plates covering his body loudly rattling in the process. "Seeing how things were developing, my stay has been cut short, and not a second too early as it seems." He briefly glanced over at the screen, still playing the same disturbing footage as before. "Does that mean you were sent here?" Curie asked, apparently picking up on Conglorch's peculiar wording in his statement. The large lizard bellowed deeply in an exhale, before starting to trot around on the carpet for a bit, obviously trying to find a comfortable position to settle down in. "You could say that," he replied after some thought, "but I wanted to come back as well. I'm interested to see how this plays out up close, especially since some interesting parts have started to move." Moore tilted her head at the statement, interested to hear what exactly the man was talking about, but having little hope that she would actually get it out of him if he wasn't volunteering the information from his own accord. "Then I am surprised this is the first place you would go," she instead mentioned, not particularly feeling like the Tenastrocyte usually preferred her company over that of many others. Conglorch laughed through his sharp teeth, and the expended air was cut apart in a hiss. "Gravity is a cruel mistress," he said, with a sideways glance at Moore. "Not much I can do to reach those on Earth, and I figured at least I wouldn't need to mind my tongue all too much around here." Moore nodded slowly. Then her gaze was inadvertently drawn back to the tragedy unfolding as they spoke. "What do you think of all this?" she inadvertently asked the reptilian, a claw firmly planted on her cheek. "I hate to sound naive, but Curie and I are quite peaceful in our existence, and I am afraid we might struggle to understand all the ramifications of this." Conglorch, in an extremely rare gesture, closed all four of his almost constantly moving eyes, and settled into a strange calm as he lowered his body to the ground, his tail swinging around to form a semicircle around him. "It's madness," he then stated, without opening his eyes. "Think of me what you will, but I also consider myself and my people peaceful at the core. Peaceful, just not pacifistic. We never desire conflict, only competition. This is a guileful action, guided by some kind of madness that I currently don't know the nature of, and I think you will find very few that will disagree with me there." "What if there was a reason behind it?" Curie suddenly asked, making both giants look confusedly into their direction. "There certainly is," Konglosh replied assuredly, and tilted his head to try and see what the cyborg was getting at. "But can you imagine a reason that would justify this?" Curie shook their bodies slowly in denial. However, they then said, "I cannot see reasons for many things that many others perceive to be obvious or natural. I do not think that this can be justified. However, the few that would disagree with me there might suddenly become a lot more numerous if a reason is applied to the action, no matter what we may think about it. Thoughts can be as varied as people are numerous, and it does not take a majority to become dangerous." The room fell quiet for a moment, as they were all more or less forced to recall the lengths some people would go to justify their actions to themselves. After all, Curie themselves had personally become a victim of that in the past. If someone could think it just to try and kill them for what they are, then what could one imagine would lead to an action like the one they were seeing before them? "Do you think they are hiding something dangerous?" Moore asked, as she glanced at the working rescue teams again, a good part of which was made up of humans aiding their Miat allies. "I think," Konglosh replied after some soul-searching on the matter, although Moore was unsure if he was deliberating on what to say, or simply on if he should even say it. "If it wasn't dangerous, they probably wouldn't be hiding it." Raprik stared at the picture on his screen, with barely held back terror in his gaze, the glass he was holding heavily shaking in his grasp, as he observed what was taking place not too far from his current location. "A better warning about this sure would have been nice," he thought to himself, trying his very best to not let his mind wander into too displeased of a direction, after he had made the very same connections about the event that people on Earth had also formed. This wasn't some random terrorist attack. This was a planned strike, carried out by someone with enough influence to make planetary defenses completely miss an armed ship taking aim at the surface. And given that it had now come to light that the target was apparently one of their contact's biggest competitors' current residents, certainly didn't make that idea any less convincing either. And Raprik didn't like that. He didn't like how convincing it was, because a convincing situation was bad. Really bad. If it was too convincing, people would start believing it without problem. Well, that was at least what his professional side was telling him. However, there was also the fact that he simply didn't like this. He didn't like it at all. Seriously, an outer orbital strike? The laws against those were basically the community's bedrock. They had been illegal since even before the Sipperslang first joined the community's precursors. It was as fundamental as a rule could get. Raprik didn't have any illusions about his position or occupation. People had died, and would probably keep dying under his influence. He wasn't a big enough fool to deny that, even if he felt justified in his actions. However, this? This wasn't taking out a crazed doctor that turned people into abominations, or trying to convince a defector of the community's ideals. This was a crime against people. This was war. This was sheer lunacy. Although, he couldn't quite allow himself to bring those feelings out to the surface. Somewhere, deep down, he knew that there was a good reason for it. There had to be. Most anything could have a justification. It just needed to be severe enough. Yet still, he struggled to think of one in this case. At least one that would satisfy him. Even if the worst case he could think of was coming true, and his imagination could be vast when it came to bad things, he still felt that it couldn't quite justify breaking a rule as important as this, at least not without trying all other options before that. Clearly that hadn't been the case, yet there had to be something that he didn't know yet, something that would make it make sense. However, he still couldn't think of it. Also, even if there was, even if it was justified somehow, he couldn't help it. He still didn't like it being done, because breaking this rule, it was dangerous. Not just because of any possible legal consequences, no, those were the least of his worries. But once a rule had been broken once, it was hard to put together again, and even harder to do so in a way that left it as strong as it was before. If the humans, or, well, anyone for that matter, but specifically the humans with their weaponry, saw this as a justification to start using outer orbital bombardments to solve their own problems as well, then the death toll would be unrivaled. Even if they probably wouldn't do it, the option even existing was terrifying. Inadvertently, he suddenly felt an empty pain radiating up from his leg. A leg that had not been there for many months now, removed by Aldrin in a cold demonstration of what happened when you cornered the wrong person. And yet, at that moment, he felt like it had never been gone. And it hurt. It hurt terribly. Not able to rub the non-existent appendage to alleviate the pain, he quickly started to stand up, reaching for his crutch to support himself. He figured taking a bit of pain relief probably couldn't hurt, ironically. As he slowly skulked over to the chest containing his belongings, his crutch clacking loudly on the ground with each hopping step he took, he suddenly felt like there were eyes on him. The ancient instincts to hide from gazes that his ancestors had left him with kicked up in a strange feeling of alertness, and it told him to go left, behind a rounded corner of this place's strange architecture, so he would be out of sight. Instead of doing that, however, he curiously glanced around at what exactly his instincts were telling him to hide from. After all, there were no eyes in the room whose gazes he could avoid. He looked in the only direction he could imagine a gaze coming from, that the rounded corner would allow him to hide away from, seeing if he could spot what exactly his instincts could have mistaken for a hostile eye. There was basically nothing over there, except for a tiny terminal in the wall that could be used for simple communications with the staff of this rather uniquely run establishment of high-class Deathworlders. Maybe he had subconsciously noticed its camera. That was technically an eye. Still, usually cameras didn't exactly trigger ancient instincts that were left over time long before cameras existed. Still, he could imagine some wires being crossed in a nervous moment like this one. He was still a Deathworlder himself, after all. Dismissing the odd feeling, mostly because the phantom pain had not let up in the slightest yet, Repreek moved on to quickly swallow a bit of pain-relieving liquid. Afterwards, he returned back to the big television in the room, deciding that it would possibly be better if he didn't miss too much information about what was going on. However, once he had returned to his previous seat, he tilted his head in surprise and thoughtfully licked at his trunk as he saw the newsfeed play out in front of him. It still showed a report about the same event, but hadn't he watched it on a different channel?